Is that my father begging under the rain? I'm a billionaire and my father is a street beggar. I can't believe this.
There are moments in a man's life that arrive without warning. Not the kind of moments you prepare for. Not the kind you see coming in a board meeting or a quarterly report or a late-night strategy session at the top of a glass tower. The kind of moment that hits you like ice water. The kind that strips away everything you've spent decades building around yourself. Every wall, every defense, every carefully constructed version of who you told the world you were. And in one single breath, in one single second, all of it is gone. And you're standing there, or sitting there, or frozen there. And you are not a billionaire anymore. You are not a Forbes cover. You are not a brand or a legacy or a $4.2 billion empire. You are just a man, a broken, terrified, guilty man. Adi, and the only question that matters in that moment is a question no amount of money in the world can answer for you. That is where this story begins. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and let us know where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's get into this. For Marcus Calloway, that moment didn't happen in a boardroom. It didn't happen on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. It didn't happen when his face made the cover of Forbes magazine, or when the anchors on CNBC were debating whether Calloway Capital was the most dominant private equity firm of its generation. It didn't happen when he signed the paperwork on his $22 million penthouse overlooking Lakeshore Drive, or when he shook hands with a sitting United States senator at a fundraiser that bore his name on the invitation. It didn't happen during any of the 10,000 moments in his life where the whole world was looking at him and telling him he had made it. None of those moments unmade Marcus Calloway. Not a single one. The moment that unmade Marcus Calloway happened on a Tuesday morning, on a sidewalk on the south side of Chicago, in the rain, when he looked through the rain-streaked window of his bulletproof black Escalade and saw his 80-year-old father sitting on the wet concrete against a brick wall. A paper cup on the ground in front of him, coins rattling, strangers walking past, nobody looking down, and Walter Calloway, the man who had raised Marcus with nothing but discipline, faith, in and both of his bare hands, sitting in the rain outside a building on the same streets where he had taught his son everything he knew about being a man. Holding a cup, begging, Marcus Calloway, a self-made, black, and worth $4.2 billion, froze. And that frozen moment, that one unbearable second, is the beginning of a story that will stay with you long after this video ends. A story about what success costs when you pay for it with silence. A story about the particular kind of pain that lives inside the Black American family, passed down not in cruelty but in pride, not in malice but in the very love that never learned how to say itself out loud. A story about fathers and sons, about what we build and what we abandon, about the lies we tell ourselves in the climb and the truth that waits for us at the bottom. He'd built a fortune of $4.2 billion from nothing. Absolutely nothing. The son of a steel mill worker from the south side of Chicago who never went to college, who never had a trust fund, never had a safety net, never had a single person hand him a door that was already open. He had built every single dollar with his own hands, his own mind, his own relentless refusal to accept that the world his father had navigated with such quiet dignity was the only world available to him. And yet right now, sitting in the back of that Escalade, watching the rain fall on a man he had not spoken to in 11 years, Marcus Calloway could not move. How does the richest black man in the room end up watching his own father beg in the street? The answer is darker and more human than anything you're imagining right now. Stay with me, because this story did not start on that sidewalk. It started 40 years before that Tuesday morning. And to understand what happened in the rain that day, you have to understand who these two men really were. Before the money, before the silence, before the 11 years of nothing. You have to go back to the beginning. There are 3 questions at the heart of this story, and I want to put them in front of you right now because they are going to drive everything you watch from this point forward. The first question is how? How does a man who knew poverty, who grew up inside it, who breathed it in, who carried it in his body the way some men carry old injuries? How does a man like that allow his own father to disappear into it? Was it negligence? Was it selfishness? Was it the kind of willful blindness that wealth can produce in even the most self-aware of men? Or was it something else entirely? Something more complicated than any of those easy answers. Because what you think the answer is right now is not the answer. And the real answer will change the way you see this entire story. The second question is why? What happened between Marcus Calloway and his father Walter that created 11 years of silence between them? Because this was not a casual drift. This was not two busy people losing touch the way people do in the noise of modern life. Something specific happened between these two men. Something was said or unsaid. Something was done or not done. And somewhere in the space between those two things, in the space between what was spoken and what was buried, a relationship that had once been the foundation of everything Marcus Calloway was simply stopped existing. What broke it? And more importantly, could it have been stopped? I want you to hold on to that question because it matters more than you know. The third question is the hardest one. When Marcus stepped out of that car on a Tuesday morning in the rain on the south side of Chicago and walked toward the old man on the sidewalk and got close enough to touch him, what happened next? What do you say to a man who built you when you find him sitting on the concrete? What do you say when every word in your vocabulary belongs to a world he never got to enter? What do you do when the most powerful version of yourself stands face to face with the most helpless version of your father? That is the question this story is really asking. And by the time we get there, it will not feel like a question about Marcus and Walter anymore. It will feel like a question about you. I am certain of that. By the end of this video, you will have every answer. But I want to warn you now, this story is not really about money. It never was. It is about what happens when a black man builds everything his father dreamed of and loses the man who taught him to dream. It is about the silence that lives inside so many black families, the silence that looks like strength from the outside and feels like grief from the inside. It is about fathers who raised their sons to be hard and sons who became so hard they forgot how to come home. And it is about one morning in Chicago when the rain fell and the traffic moved and the world went on turning. And a man who had spent 20 years running finally stopped and looked at what was right in front of him. Stay with me, because this story starts not in Chicago, not in a boardroom, not in the rain. It starts in a 2-bedroom apartment on 79th Street in 1981. And you need to know what that place was before you can understand what it cost to leave it. The South Side of Chicago is not one thing. It never has been. People outside of it tend to think in headlines, in statistics, in the kind of language that flattens a place into a symbol of what America gets wrong. But the people who were born there and raised there and loved there know something different. They know that the South Side is a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary pain, living inside the same block, sometimes inside the same building, sometimes inside the same family. They know that the South Side produces people, extraordinary, complicated, brilliant, stubborn, proud, wounded people, the way certain kinds of soil produce certain kinds of trees, slow, deep-rooted, built to survive conditions that would break anything less committed to standing. Marcus Calloway was one of those people, and before he was a billionaire, before he was a brand, before he was a name that appeared in financial publications alongside words like visionary and transformational, he was just a kid on 79th Street. And the most important person in his world was his father. Walter Calloway was a man of few words and enormous presence. He stood 6'1" but seemed taller because of the way he carried himself. The way men of his generation who had survived what he had survived tended to carry themselves, like they were always bracing against something. Like the weight of the world was a familiar physical sensation that they had simply learned to walk upright through. He had worked at a steel processing facility in Gary, Indiana for 34 years. 34 years of shift work, of heat and noise and physical labor, of a commute across the state line that he made 5 days a week without complaint, because complaining about the work was a luxury he could not afford and would not have allowed himself even if he could. He was a deacon at Greater Harvest Baptist Church on the South Side. He was a man who pressed his shirts. He was a man who shook hands with full eye contact and expected the same in return. He was, by every measure that mattered in the world he inhabited, a man of dignity. He raised Marcus and Marcus's younger brother Darnell largely by himself after their mother Diane passed away when Marcus was just 12 years old. And this is a part of the story that people who only see the Forbes cover never know. This is the part that lives underneath the success, underneath the numbers, underneath the name on the private equity fund, and the planes in the penthouse. Marcus Calloway grew up in a house shaped by grief that no one talked about. His mother's death at 44 years old was a wound that his father did not have the language for, could not have been given the language for by the world he lived in, and so he did the only thing he knew how to do. He kept moving. He kept working. He kept the lights on and the refrigerator full and the boys in school with clean clothes and the sense that even though one of the two most important people in their universe was gone, the structure of their lives would hold. Walter Calloway held it together through sheer will, and the cost of that kind of holding, the cost of that particular performance of strength, is something this story will return to. Because it always does. What Walter gave Marcus was not warmth in the way that word is often understood. It was not softness or ease or the kind of childhood where feelings were talked about over dinner. What Walter gave Marcus was something harder and in some ways more enduring. He gave him standards. He gave him the expectation of excellence in a world that would set the bar lower for him because of the color of his skin. He gave him the understanding, installed early and never softened, that a black man in America had to be twice as prepared, twice as disciplined, and twice as composed as anyone else in the room. Not because it was fair, because it was not fair, it was never fair, and Walter never pretended otherwise, but because that was the game, and the game did not care about fairness. The game only cared about results. And if Marcus wanted results, he had to work. There was no other answer. There had never been another answer in the Calloway house. Marcus absorbed all of it. He was, from a young age, the kind of child who made every adult in his orbit feel the particular mixture of pride and worry that extraordinary children tend to produce. Pride because they seem destined for something. Worry because that destination always costs something too. His teachers noticed him. His pastor noticed him. His father noticed him in the way that proud fathers notice their sons, quietly and completely, without ever quite finding the words to say so directly. Marcus won a partial academic scholarship to the University of Illinois at Chicago. It was not a full ride. Walter made up the difference for 2 years by taking on weekend work at a warehouse. He never told Marcus that. Marcus only found out years later from an aunt. By the time he found out, he and his father had not spoken in 8 years. Marcus lasted 2 years at UIC before an idea he could not let go of pulled him out. He was 22 years old and he had already identified a gap in private equity financing for black-owned small businesses. A gap so large and so consistent and so obviously rooted in structural bias that he could not understand why no one had built something specifically to address it. So he decided he would. He left school. Walter did not understand this decision. Walter had worked 34 years to give his sons the thing he never had, which was the education that would get them into rooms that had been closed to men like him. And now his eldest son was voluntarily walking out of one of those rooms before he had finished earning his place in it. They argued. It was the first real argument between them. It was loud and it was honest in the way that arguments between fathers and sons who love each other can be, and when it was over, neither of them fully recovered from it. Something had shifted, not broken, not yet, but shifted. Marcus went on to build what he had envisioned. It took years. It was not a smooth trajectory. There were deals that fell apart and investors who said no, and months when he was eating rice and beans and running his operation out of a shared desk in a rented co-working space on the west side. But he had his father's stubbornness and his mother's spirit and a level of hunger that people who have never been genuinely poor can never fully replicate, no matter how badly they want to, because that kind of hunger is not a motivational tool. It is a memory in the body. And Marcus Calloway never forgot what it felt like to have nothing. It drove him every single day. It is still driving him on the morning that this story begins. It is driving him as his Escalade moves down Lakeshore Drive toward a meeting that will close a $900 million acquisition. It is driving him when his driver takes an unexpected detour through a part of the South Side that Marcus has not driven through in years. And it is still driving him, or it was still driving him, right up until the moment his eyes found the man on the sidewalk, and everything in his body, every instinct, every defense, every mechanism of forward motion, simply stopped. But before we get back to that sidewalk, we need to understand what happened in the years between that first argument over college and that Tuesday morning in the rain. We need to understand the silence, because the silence is the real story. And it began not with a fight, not with a betrayal, not with a dramatic rupture that either man could point to and say, that is when it broke. It began the way most silences between fathers and sons begin. It began with distance that nobody addressed, with a phone that rang less often, with visits that became holidays only, then holidays every other year, then a Christmas card and a check, with a son who was climbing so fast and so hard that looking down began to feel like looking backward, and looking backward began to feel like the one thing he could not afford. And with a father who was watching his son's name appear in newspapers and on television, and who felt something in his chest every time he saw it, that was not entirely pride and was not entirely pain, but was some complicated mixture of both that he had no way to resolve, and so he simply held it. The way he had held everything, silently and alone. Walter Calloway turned 75 in the spring. His church threw him a celebration dinner in the fellowship hall. There was a cake, and there were friends, and there were grandchildren from Darnell's family running around the tables. Marcus was not there. He sent a card. He sent a check. He meant to call, but there was a deal closing in Singapore, and the time difference made it complicated, and by the time the day was over, he told himself he would call the next day. He did not call the next day. A family friend reached Marcus a week later and told him, gently, carefully, the way people tell you things they do not entirely want to be the ones telling you, that Walter had sat at that table all evening and kept looking at the door. Marcus said thank you and hung up and went back to work. He did not call his father that night either. He would think about this for the rest of his life. Here is what nobody tells you about the climb. Not the motivational speakers, not the business school case studies, not the magazine profiles with the posed photographs and the carefully chosen quotes. Nobody tells you that the higher you get, the quieter the things you left behind become. Not because they stop mattering, but because you get so good at filling every hour of every day with something that requires your full attention, that the quiet things, the things that do not send emails, that do not call your assistant, that do not schedule themselves into your calendar, gradually stop reaching you, not because they give up on you, because you have built a life so loud, so full, so relentlessly forward-facing, that the soft voice of an old man in Gary, Indiana, simply cannot compete with the noise. And the tragedy is that you do not even notice it happening. You do not wake up one day and decide to be the kind of man who lets his father disappear. You just keep running and running and running. Until a Tuesday morning in March, when a driver takes a detour and your eyes find something through a rain-streaked window that your whole body recognizes before your mind has time to protect you from it. The morning of March the 14th started the way every morning started for Marcus Calloway when he was in Chicago for business. A 6:15 wake up at the Langham Hotel. 45 minutes of emails in bed before he even stood up. A black coffee from the in-room service that he drank while reviewing the final terms of the Meridian Group acquisition. A $900 million deal that had taken 14 months to structure and was closing that afternoon at 2 o'clock in a 42nd floor conference room downtown. He was shaved and dressed and in the elevator by 7:45. His assistant, Jerome, was already in the lobby with a printed briefing packet and a second coffee. His driver, a retired Chicago police officer named Leonard, who had worked for Marcus for 6 years, had the Escalade idling at the curb. This was the machine of Marcus Calloway's life. Precise, efficient, moving always forward, never backward. There was no mechanism in this machine for backward. They pulled out onto Lakeshore Drive, heading north toward the Loop. Marcus was on a call within 4 minutes. He was reviewing numbers, confirming terms, preparing himself for a meeting that would change the financial landscape of 3 companies and the professional lives of several hundred people. He was doing what he had always done, He was working. And then, approximately 20 minutes into the drive, Leonard's voice came from the front of the car. "Mr. Calloway, I'm going to have to come off the drive. There's construction backed up ahead, about a mile. I'll take 79th across and come back up Michigan." Marcus said fine without looking up from his phone. Leonard took the exit. The Escalade moved west, then south, down into the grid of streets that Marcus Calloway had grown up inside of. Streets whose names he had not thought about in years, but whose shapes he still carried in his body, the way you carry the layout of the first place you ever called home. They were moving slowly through traffic on 79th Street when Marcus ended his call and looked up for the first time in 20 minutes. And it was just a glance, just the casual, momentary lifting of the eyes that you do when you have been looking at a screen too long and your brain demands a few seconds of nothing. Just a glance through the rain-streaked window at the gray morning outside, at the wet sidewalk, at the brick buildings, at the pedestrians moving through the rain with their collars turned up and their heads down. He was already looking back at his phone when something made him look up again. Some signal from somewhere below conscious thought. Some instinct that his mind had not authorized, but his body had already obeyed. There was a man against the wall of a building across the street. Older, sitting on the wet concrete, legs extended, back against the brick. A paper cup in front of him. The man's head was slightly down, the way people sit when they want to be present without being visible. When they have made their peace with a situation but have not quite lost the pride that makes them reluctant to look up at the people walking past them. There was a worn overcoat on the man's frame. Dark, heavy, the kind of coat that had once been a good coat. The kind of coat that a man had taken care of for a long time before circumstances stopped making that possible. Marcus Calloway looked at this man for 2 seconds and then looked back at his phone. He typed something. He started to read. And then his hand stopped, and the phone stayed where it was in his hands, but he was not reading it anymore. He was somewhere else. He was inside something that was happening in his chest and in his stomach and behind his eyes. Something that had no name in the vocabulary of a man who had spent 20 years training himself to respond to situations rather than feel them. He looked back up at the window. He looked at the man against the wall again, and this time he did not look away. He knew that coat. He knew the weight of those shoulders. He knew the angle of that jaw, even from across a rain-slicked street through a car window, even after 11 years. He knew the way that man's hands rested, even curled around a paper cup on a wet sidewalk. He knew because you do not forget the hands of the person who first taught you what hands were for. You do not forget the posture of the person who was the first definition of what a man looked like when you were small enough that everything was still being defined for you. Marcus Calloway had spent 20 years building an empire on top of the things his father had installed in him, and all of it, every brick of it, was organized around the shape of this man, and now that shape was on the sidewalk in the rain. His voice, when it came, was very quiet. "Leonard, stop the car." Leonard stopped the car. "Pull over." Leonard pulled over, and Marcus Calloway sat there for a moment, for just a moment, with his hand on the door handle. Not because he was uncertain about whether that was his father. He was not uncertain. He knew. He had known from the first glance in the way that the body always knows what the mind tries to negotiate. He sat there for a moment because there is a specific kind of reckoning that requires even the strongest of men to take one breath before they step into it. Because some doors, once you open them, do not close again. And what was on the other side of this door was 11 years, and a silence that had no clean edges, and a guilt so heavy it had become structural, and a question he had buried so deep and for so long that he had almost forgotten he was the one who buried it. Almost. He opened the door. He stepped out into the rain in his $4,000 suit. He crossed the street. He walked toward the man against the wall with the paper cup, and with each step the city seemed to get quieter, the way it sometimes does when something is happening that is too large for the ordinary noise of the world to contain. And then he was there, standing over his father on the sidewalk of 79th Street, and in the same neighborhood where Walter Calloway had once taught him to tie a Windsor knot and shake a man's hand and hold his chin up when the world tried to push it down. Marcus crouched down beside his father, the way you crouch beside someone when you want to be at their level. when you want to not be above them. Walter Calloway's head came up slowly. His eyes, those dark, steady, careful eyes that Marcus had been reading for expressions of pride or disappointment his entire life, found his son's face. And they were not surprised. They were not grateful. They were not relieved. They were not angry. They were something that Marcus did not have a word for right then. Something still and deep and fully inhabited. The eyes of a man who had already been wherever this moment was taking them. Who had already arrived there, alone, in a long time ago. Marcus said, "Dad, it's me." Walter Calloway looked at his son for a long time before he answered. When he did, his voice was the same voice Marcus had been hearing since before he understood language. Low, deliberate. A voice that had never once in 80 years asked the world for permission to take up space. "I know who you are." And those 4 words in that voice, on that sidewalk, in the rain, with the city moving around them as though nothing was happening, fell on Marcus Calloway like the full weight of a decade. Like every unanswered call, every missed birthday, every card instead of a visit. Every year of silence that he had told himself was not really silence, but just the natural result of 2 busy lives moving in different directions. When all of it arrived in those 4 words with a precision and a force that no boardroom confrontation, no hostile acquisition, no financial crisis had ever matched. Because it was not cruelty. Walter Calloway was not being cruel. He was simply being completely, entirely honest. And that honesty was more devastating than any accusation. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. A reflex, an instinct built from years of solving problems with resources. Walter raised one hand, just slightly, a gesture so familiar that Marcus's hand stopped before his conscious mind instructed it to. "Stop. I don't need your money, son." The word son landing the way it does when it comes from the mouth of an 80-year-old man in the rain, after 11 years of silence, with everything it contains, every memory, every sacrifice, and every suppressed thing that never got said, Marcus's hand dropped. "Then what do you need?" The question came out of him smaller than he intended, quieter, less certain than anything he had said in 20 years. Walter Calloway did not answer. He looked at Marcus for a moment longer. Then he looked back down at the cup on the wet ground in front of him, and the city kept moving around them. A bus passed. Someone's music drifted from a car window and then was gone. And Marcus Calloway, worth $4.2 billion, crouching on the sidewalk in the rain on the street where he grew up, had nothing. Not one word. Not one resource that applied. Not one strategy. For the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely nothing. And in the complete emptiness of that moment, in the silence that lived between what he had built and what he had lost, Marcus Calloway understood something that no amount of money had been able to teach him, and no success had been able to show him, that all of it, every dollar, every deal, every building with his name on it, every photograph, every accolade, was built on a foundation he had never repaired. And foundations that are never repaired do not hold forever. They simply wait. They wait until the moment when you are finally still enough to feel what they have been trying to tell you. And this morning on 79th Street, in the rain, his father's silence was the loudest thing Marcus Calloway had ever heard. The first thing Marcus Calloway did was what Marcus Calloway always did when confronted with a problem. He applied resources to it. He called Leonard on the phone and told him to pull the car around. He helped his father to his feet, slowly, more carefully, the way you help someone stand when you are not sure if they are going to let you, but you are not willing to ask for permission, because asking for permission feels too much like accepting the possibility that they will say no. Walter did not resist. He stood. He was still tall, still carrying himself with that particular Calloway uprightness that Marcus recognized in his own posture in mirrors and in photographs, and in the way his own children sometimes stood when they did not know he was watching them. Walter did not say anything. He let Marcus guide him to the car. He got in, and they rode in silence to the Langham Hotel. Marcus called Jerome before they arrived and had a suite arranged, clothes organized from a nearby department store. Walter's size, which Marcus knew by memory, which is a strange thing to know about a man you have not seen in 11 years, but the body holds what the mind tries to release. A doctor contacted for a private afternoon appointment, a meal arranged from a restaurant nearby. He did it all with the efficiency of a man who had spent 2 decades solving large, complicated problems and was now applying that same machinery to a situation that the machinery was entirely unqualified to handle. And when Walter sat at the table in the hotel suite that evening and looked at the white linen and the polished silverware and the plate arranged for him like he was a guest at a banquet he had not been invited to, and said nothing, just looked at it and then looked out the window at the city below them, Marcus understood for the first time that he had gotten this wrong, completely and entirely wrong. When he had turned a human being into a logistical problem and applied a logistical solution, and the human being was sitting right there, looking at the city where he had lived his whole life from an elevation he had never asked for, and he was not grateful, and he was not relieved, and he was not healed. He was still the same man who had been sitting on the sidewalk 2 hours ago. The sidewalk had simply been upgraded. That was all Marcus had actually done. For 3 days, Marcus stayed in Chicago and tried to understand how this had happened. He reached out through family channels, through old connections on the South Side, through the kind of quiet investigative work that powerful men can do when they have the right people and the right questions. He wanted to know the sequence of events. He wanted to know who had known what and when and why no one had told him. And what he found initially redirected his attention toward his cousin Darnell, who had been loosely designated years earlier as a family point of contact for Walter, the person who was supposed to be checking in, supposed to be keeping an eye on things, supposed to be the connection between the old man in Gary and the son in Chicago. Marcus focused hard on Darnell for 2 days, because Darnell was a manageable answer. Darnell was a problem that fit inside a framework Marcus understood. Someone had dropped the ball. Someone had failed in a responsibility. Marcus would address that failure and restructure the situation and move forward. That was a story he knew how to finish. Except the story was not that story. When Marcus finally sat down with Darnell, what he found was a man who was himself barely keeping his head above water, working 2 jobs since a layoff 18 months ago, with 2 kids in school and a mortgage that was more stress than he wanted to discuss with his billionaire cousin. Darnell had known Walter was struggling. He had told Walter repeatedly to call Marcus. Walter had refused every time. Darnell had gone by when he could, which was not often enough because he was tired and stretched, and the kind of tired that comes from carrying your own weight when the weight is already more than you were designed for. He had not reached out to Marcus directly, because reaching out to Marcus had always felt to Darnell like reaching out to a distant institution rather than a family member. And Darnell did not entirely know how to explain that, without it becoming something that went in a direction nobody wanted it to go. Marcus sat with this for a long time, because it was not the answer he had prepared himself for. There was no villain in the version of the story that Darnell gave him. There was no theft, no betrayal, no drop ball that a reasonable person could be held accountable for. There was just the weight of things. The cumulative, invisible weight of a family that had been slowly drifting apart for years, quietly, without drama, without a single clear turning point. The way all families do when the people at the center of them stop doing the work of staying connected and start assuming that connection will maintain itself. And the only name that kept appearing in the center of that picture, no matter how many times Marcus rearranged the pieces, was his own. He canceled the rest of his Chicago schedule. He sat with Walter in the hotel suite through 2 more evenings before Walter agreed to sit down for a real conversation. Not at the hotel, at a diner on the South Side, a place called Patterson's that had been open since 1971, that had the same ceiling fans and the same Formica tabletops and the same sweet tea that Marcus remembered from childhood Saturday mornings when Walter would bring the boys here after church. Walter ordered coffee and a short stack of pancakes and said nothing for a while. Marcus ordered the same thing and said nothing back, and it was the most honest 10 minutes either of them had spent together in over a decade, sitting in that silence in that diner, because at least the silence had no pretense in it. At least the silence was real. When Walter finally spoke, it was not what Marcus had expected. It was not grief. It was not anger. It was not a list of grievances or an accounting of absences or a verdict. It was 9 words. Walter set down his coffee cup, looked at his son directly for the first time since the sidewalk, and said, You made it real clear I wasn't part of your world." Marcus opened his mouth and Walter raised one hand. Barely, just enough. Not a gesture of anger, a gesture of completion. He had said the thing. The thing had been said. There was a brief pause, the kind of pause that forms around a truth that has been waiting too long to be spoken. And then Walter said one more thing. "It wasn't what you said to me. It was what you stopped saying. There's a difference. It's son, and you know it. And Marcus did know it. He had always known it. He had just never been still long enough to face it." 9 words. And then 8 more. And Marcus Calloway, who had negotiated billion-dollar contracts across 4 continents, who had sat across tables from presidents of companies and presidents of countries, and never once not known exactly what to say next, had nothing. Because there is no counter-argument to the truth. You cannot restructure it. You cannot acquire your way around it. You can only sit with it in a diner on the South Side, in the light of a gray Chicago morning, and let it do what it came to do. And what it came to do, in this case, was to open the first real conversation these 2 men had attempted in 11 years. Stumbling, incomplete, long overdue, but real. It was in that conversation that Walter mentioned, for the first time, the letter. He mentioned it the way you mention something that you assume the other person already knew about. The kind of casual reference that sits in the air between 2 people for a moment before one of them realizes that the other is looking at them blankly. And the blank look means not what you thought it meant, but something worse. Walter said, "I wrote to you. Before all of this, years ago, I figured you dealt with what I said in that letter in your own way, in your own time." Marcus was quiet. Walter looked at him. "You got that letter, didn't you, son?" It was not a question. And the way Marcus did not answer was an answer of its own kind. Walter looked out the window at the street. He was quiet for a long time. "Aslan, your assistant called me 2 weeks after I mailed it. Said you were traveling and she'd pass on that I'd reached out." He paused. "That was the last time I tried." He picked up his coffee cup and looked at it and did not say anything else for a moment. And Marcus understood, sitting there, that 11 years of silence between them had hinged on a letter that was sitting in a filing archive in an office building that no longer existed, in a folder that no one had opened, because his assistant had done her job exactly as instructed, and his job had been too loud and too full, and too relentlessly forward-moving to leave room for anything that did not schedule itself. 11 years, because of a letter. Or so it seemed. Because there was still one thing Marcus did not know. One thing that, when he found out, it would reframe everything he had seen and heard and felt from the moment his eyes found his father on that sidewalk. And that thing was this. Walter Calloway's presence on that corner of 79th Street was not an accident. Walter produced a photocopy of the letter from inside the worn jacket he had been wearing when Marcus found him on the street. He produced it carefully, the way you produce something you have been keeping safe despite not having much to keep things safe in. It was folded twice in a standard number 10 envelope that had been opened and resealed with tape. He slid it across the Formica table without a word. Marcus picked it up. He turned it over. He looked at his father's handwriting on the front. Careful, deliberate, to the handwriting of a man who did not write letters often and who meant every word of the ones he did write. And then he opened it. The letter was 6 pages long, handwritten on lined notebook paper in blue ink. Walter had written it in October of 2013. Marcus had been 41 years old that year. Calloway Capital had just crossed $2 billion in assets under management. Marcus had been on the cover of Black Enterprise magazine 3 months earlier. He had been in Singapore when the letter arrived at his Chicago office. He had been in Singapore, and then Frankfurt, and then New York, and then back to Chicago, and then Los Angeles, and the letter had arrived and been sorted by his assistant into a folder marked Personal Correspondence, Pending Review. And that folder had been pending review from October 2013 until Marcus sat down in that diner in 2024, and his father slid the photocopy across the table, and 11 years collapsed into the distance between 2 cups of coffee on a Formica surface. The letter was about Marcus's mother. It was about Diane. It was about what happened to her, and more importantly, about what Walter had always known and never said. Diane Calloway had not simply gotten sick and died the way Marcus had been allowed to believe. The way children are sometimes allowed to believe versions of adult tragedies that have been shaped to be survivable rather than true. Diane had been suffering for years before she died, suffering in the way that Black women in the early 1980s suffered quietly, without diagnosis, without the language that we now have for what she was experiencing, without the cultural permission to say out loud that she was drowning. She had tried to reach for help through the church, through family, through the limited channels available to her. She had been met, as Black women of her time and place so often were, with prayer and the instruction to be strong, and the implication that the kind of help she needed was not for people who looked like her, not for families who lived where they lived, and not for situations that were supposed to be handled internally, with faith, with endurance, with the particular silence that had been made to look like dignity. Walter wrote in the letter that he had known she was struggling more than he let on to anyone, including to himself, for a long time. He wrote that he had not gotten her the help she needed, not because he did not love her, he had loved her completely and without reservation, but because the world he lived in had told him in every way available to it that men like him did not ask for help, and families like theirs did not go outside the family with their pain. He wrote that not a day had passed since Diane died that he did not carry the question of what might have been different. He wrote it without self-pity, without dramatic language, without asking Marcus for anything in return for the confession except to know, just to know the truth. Because Walter had had a health scare in the summer of 2013, a cardiac event that the doctors called a warning, that Walter called a message. And he had decided that if something happened to him, he could not leave his son carrying a false version of his mother's story for the rest of his life. And then there was the second thing in the letter. The thing that Walter had needed to say almost as much as the first thing. He wrote that he had spent a long time watching Marcus build his life on a particular foundation, a foundation of self-sufficiency so absolute and so uncompromising that it had become its own kind of prison. He wrote that he recognized that foundation because he had poured it himself. Now, he had taught Marcus that needing people was weakness. He had taught him by example and by silence and by the performance of indestructibility that being a strong Black man meant standing alone. He had taught Marcus that emotions were subordinate to results, that vulnerability was a liability, that the goal was always forward, and the people you left behind in the pursuit of forward would understand because they knew what the pursuit cost and why it mattered. Walter wrote, "I thought I was giving you something. Now I wonder if I took something from you too. I am sorry, son, not for raising you hard, but for never once showing you that a strong man is also allowed to break." Marcus read the letter. He read it again. He set it down on the Formica table and looked out the window at 79th Street, at the south side, at the neighborhood that had built him, and he was quiet for a very long time. The kind of quiet that has weight, the kind of quiet that happens when everything inside you is rearranging itself around a new truth. He had built $4.2 billion on a wound he had not known he was carrying. The belief that needing people was weakness. The belief installed in him at 12 years old by a grieving father who was doing the only thing he knew how to do. And now that father was sitting across from him in a diner with a short stack of pancakes and the letter he had written in 2013, and the quiet patience of a man who had already been to the other side of this conversation in his own mind 1,000 times and was simply waiting for his son to arrive. Walter said, "I didn't tell you all that to take something from you, Marcus. Yeah, I told you so you could put something down." And Marcus Calloway sat with that sentence. He sat with it the way you sit with the sentence that reorganizes your interior life, the way you sit with the thing that arrives too late and just in time simultaneously. He sat with it for a long time. And then he looked at his father and he said, "I never got the letter, Dad." And Walter said, "I know." And neither of them said anything else for a while. Because sometimes the most honest response to the truth is simply to let it be true, to stop negotiating with it, to stop building defenses against it, to just let it be what it is and feel what it demands to be felt. And in a diner on the south side of Chicago, for the first time in his adult life, Marcus Calloway let something be true without managing it. He sat in it. He let it land. Sure, he let his father see it land. And Walter Calloway looked at his son and said nothing and that nothing was the most complete communication that had passed between them in 11 years. But here is where the story turns. Here is the thing that, when Marcus finally learned it, did not diminish what he already understood about his father, but added something to it that changed the entire shape of everything. Because Marcus had been operating under the assumption that his father's presence on that sidewalk was a pure product of circumstance, that Walter had drifted into homelessness, the way people drift into things when the structures around them erode slowly, and pride prevents them from calling for help. And part of that was true. Walter had been in genuine hardship for the better part of 8 months. The sequence of events that had led him there was real. The pension cut, the mounting medical costs, the apartment he could no longer afford, the options that ran out one by one. That part was not theater. That part was the hard truth of what happens to elderly black men in America when the systems around them fail and their pride prevents them from making the one call that could have changed everything. But 3 weeks before the morning, Marcus found him on the sidewalk. Walter Calloway had heard something through a distant connection in the community. A woman who attended Greater Harvest Baptist knew a man who worked for a Chicago city subcontractor involved in the infrastructure project on Lakeshore Drive, and this woman had mentioned in passing to Walter during a visit to his sister's house, and that the construction on the drive had been rerouting traffic through the south side for weeks, rerouting it down 79th Street, and she had also mentioned the way people mention things in communities that are small enough to know everyone's business and large enough to pretend they don't, that Marcus Calloway was in Chicago that week for a big deal. She had read it in the business section. Walter had listened to this. He had said nothing in response. He had looked out the window and held the information quietly inside him, the way he had always held everything. And then, starting 4 mornings before the Tuesday when Marcus found him, Walter Calloway had been on that corner, every morning, in the cold, in the rain when it rained, and with his paper cup and his worn coat and his 80-year-old body that did not belong on concrete in a Chicago winter. 4 mornings, with no guarantee that Marcus would come down that street, with no certainty that the detour would still be in effect, with no backup plan if the car came past and Marcus did not look up from his phone, or looked up and looked away, or saw him and told Leonard to keep moving because there was a deal closing at 2 o'clock and the world did not stop for the old man on the sidewalk. Walter Calloway, 80 years old and not in good health and having nothing, sat on that corner for 4 mornings on a bet that his son would look up. And on the 4th morning, the son looked up. When Marcus understood this, when the full picture assembled itself in front of him, he sat with it for a long time before he said a word. And then he said, "You could have frozen out there, Dad." And Walter said, "I know." And Marcus said, "You could have called me. You could have had someone call me. You could have done 100 things that did not involve sitting on a sidewalk in a Chicago winter." And Walter looked at him with those steady, careful eyes and said, "If you were going to come back to me, I needed it to be because you chose it. Not because I showed up at your office with my hand out. I needed you to choose me, son." There is a particular kind of love that lives in the Black American family that does not announce itself, that does not press or perform or demand, that endures in silence and in patience and in the quiet, an extraordinary willingness to wait, to keep showing up even when showing up costs everything, to bet on your child when you have nothing left to bet with except the belief, stubborn and undefeated, that the person they taught you to be is still in there somewhere underneath all that distance and all that money and all those years of running. Walter Calloway had nothing, and he had used it all to be on that corner. 4 mornings, in the cold, waiting for his son to look up. And when Marcus finally understood that, something in him that had been moving for 20 years went still. Marcus Calloway did not put his father in a penthouse. He did not hire a private nurse or set up a management structure around Walter's care the way he set up management structures around his companies. He did not turn his father into an asset class. He had already tried that in the hotel suite, and he understood now with the clarity that only arrives after you have failed completely in one approach, that it was the wrong answer. So instead, he did something that had not been in his behavioral vocabulary since before he could remember. He asked his father what he wanted. Walter thought about it. He looked at his coffee cup, and then he looked at the table, and then he looked out the window, and he thought about it with the thoroughness of a man who has not been asked what he wants in a long time, and who takes the question seriously because it deserves to be taken seriously. And then he said, I want to go back to Greater Harvest. I want to sit in my pew on Sunday morning. I want to have dinner at a real table with people who know my name. I want to be somebody's father again. Not somebody's problem, somebody's father. Marcus listened to every word of this. He did not interrupt. He did not offer alternatives or optimizations. He listened the way he should have been listening for 11 years. And when Walter was finished, Marcus nodded, just nodded and said, Okay, Dad. Marcus found a 2-bedroom condo 3 blocks from his own Lincoln Park apartment. Not extravagant, clean, bright, a view of the park, good light in the morning, the way Walter had always liked good light in the morning. He stocked it the way Walter's kitchen had always been stocked. The specific brand of coffee, the specific cereal, the particular things that you only know to buy for a person if you knew them before the distance set in and are paying attention now that it has. He drove Walter to Greater Harvest on the first Sunday after they moved him in. He did not go inside. Walter had not asked him to, but he sat in the parking lot for the full 2 hours of service, and then he drove his father home. The following Sunday, he went inside. He sat in the back. He had not been inside a church since his mother's funeral. He sat in the back and he listened, and he did not perform anything. He just sat there and let it be what it was. He started coming by on Sunday afternoons, not always to talk. Sometimes they watched football. Sometimes they sat on the balcony and looked at the park below and said very little because very little needed to be said when you were just present, when presence itself was the point. Sometimes Walter cooked and Marcus ate what his father made without comment or request, and it tasted like something from a time before everything became complicated, and Marcus ate it slowly. He stopped scheduling things on Sunday afternoons. His assistant knew not to book anything Sunday afternoons. Whatever it cost him in deals not pursued and meetings not taken, it was not a calculation he was willing to make anymore. Some things, once you understand what they cost to lose, you stop treating like variables. There is more to this story. There is one more piece that arrived 6 months after the sidewalk, when Marcus was helping Walter organize the condo and came across something in a cardboard box that Walter had brought with him from his sister's house. A small notebook and a series of receipts folded inside it. Marcus looked at the receipts without immediately understanding what they were. And then, one by one, he began to understand. During the 3 weeks that Walter had been on that corner of 79th Street, he had not been alone. He had been sitting near 2 other men. A 67-year-old veteran named Roosevelt James, who had been living rough for close to 2 years, struggling with the kind of wounds that the VA had tried and failed to fully address in the decades since he came home from his second deployment, and a 51-year-old man named Calvin Price, a construction worker whose work had dried up the previous winter and whose marriage had not survived the financial pressure that followed, who was sleeping in a shelter 3 blocks away and eating 1 meal a day. Walter had talked to these men. Over those 3 weeks, he had come to know them the way people come to know each other when they are occupying the same small piece of ground in difficult circumstances and have nothing to hide and nothing to perform. He knew Roosevelt's daughter's name. He knew Calvin was worried about missing his youngest son's birthday because the shelter had a curfew. He knew them. And when Marcus had first put money into Walter's account after the hotel, $10,000 quickly a starting point. Walter had done something with a portion of it before Marcus even realized he had access to the account. He had found out, through the shelter and through a community health worker he had met at Greater Harvest, where Roosevelt could access a VA mental health program that had an opening. He had covered the enrollment fee and the first month of transportation costs. He had quietly found Calvin a room in a rooming house managed by a deacon from the church and paid the first 2 months of rent. He had left an envelope for the benevolence fund at Greater Harvest with a note in his handwriting that said simply, "For the men who have nowhere to go this winter." Marcus sat on the floor of the condo holding these receipts for a long time. He looked up at his father eventually. Walter was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching him look at the receipts. Marcus said, "Dad." He could not immediately find the rest of the sentence. Walter shrugged. Just shrugged with the particular economy of motion that is the language of a man who does not need much ceremony. "They were there with me," Walter said. "Couldn't just leave them." That was all he said. He went back into the kitchen. And Marcus sat on the floor with the receipts in his hands and understood that the man who had been sitting on that sidewalk with a paper cup, the man he had needed to rescue, the man he had applied resources to, the man he had built a condo around and stocked a kitchen for, had, with the first money that came into his hands, turned immediately toward the men sitting beside him and taken care of them. Walter Calloway, at 80 years old with nothing, was still a deacon, still a covering, still someone's answer when they had no other answer. He had not waited to be stable before he was generous. He had not waited until the problem of his own life was solved before he addressed the problems of the lives next to his. He had simply done what he had always done, one in the steel mill and in the church and on 79th Street and in every year of raising two boys alone after their mother died. He had looked at the people around him and asked what they needed and found a way to give it. That was who Walter Calloway was. That was who he had always been. And Marcus, sitting on the floor of the condo with the receipts in his hands, finally understood what his father had given him that was worth more than any lesson about strength or discipline or the particular demands placed on black men in America. He had given him the example of a life that was oriented toward other people, a life where showing up for the people next to you was not a reward you gave yourself after you had succeeded. It was the point. It had always been the point. And somewhere in the 20 years of building his empire, Marcus had forgotten, or maybe he had never quite learned it in the first place. Either way, he understood it now. He understood it sitting on the floor of a condo in Lincoln Park with a box of receipts in his lap and his father making coffee in the kitchen and the afternoon light coming through the windows over the park. He understood it the way you understand the most important things. Not all at once, not in a single bright moment of revelation, but slowly in the body, like warmth returning to something that has been cold for a very long time. There is something that this story asks of every man watching it right now, and I want to say it plainly because plainness is what it deserves. There is a generation of black men in this country who were raised to be strong in every way that could be measured, to work hard, to provide, to not complain, to not need, to not break, to hold things together through sheer force of will and performance of indestructibility because the world required it of them, and they did not have the luxury of a different answer. They passed that down to their sons, and their sons built careers and companies and reputations on top of that inheritance, and somewhere in the climb, those sons got far away from those fathers. Not because they stopped loving them, not because they chose distance as an act of cruelty, but because the climb requires a tunnel vision that makes everything outside the tunnel, including the people who built the tunnel in the first place, slowly disappear from view. And by the time you look up, outright, the distance is real and the silence is real and the paper cup is real and the rain is real and the man on the sidewalk is your father. And the only thing left to do is open the door. Marcus Calloway rebuilt something that had been broken. It did not happen overnight, and it did not happen without pain, and it did not produce a version of the relationship that erased the 11 years that came before it. Those years are still there. They will always be there. But there is something on the other side of honest reckoning that is worth more than what was lost in the years before it. Something quiet and real, and built not on performance, but on truth. Every Sunday afternoon in Lincoln Park, the football on the television, the coffee in the morning, the drive to Greater Harvest, the presence itself, a steady and unperformed and no longer conditional on whether the world was watching. That is what Marcus Calloway built in the last chapter of this story. Not a monument, not a redemption arc designed for a press release, just a Sunday afternoon, just his father's voice in the other room, just the sound of someone who had been waiting a very long time to stop waiting. And the quiet knowledge that even when it is late, it is not always too late. Even when the silence has lasted 11 years. Even when the paper cup is full and the rain is falling and the city is moving around you and nobody is stopping. It is not always too late. All it takes is for someone in that car to look up. I want to ask you something before you go, and I want you to actually sit with the question rather than scroll past it. When Marcus looked through that window and saw his father on the sidewalk, in that first moment, in those first 2 seconds before he looked back down at his phone, what would you have done? Not the version of yourself you want to be, the actual version of yourself that exists right now today, with the life you have and the distance you have allowed, and the calls you have not made, and the visits you have been meaning to make. In that moment, with the deal closing at 2 o'clock and the driver waiting and the city moving around you, and a figure against a wall that your body recognized before your mind did, what would you have done? Would you have stepped out of that car? Or would you have told yourself you were not sure enough, not ready enough, that now was not the right time, that you would figure it out later, that later was always available, that some things could wait? I want to know. Drop your answer in the comments right now, be honest, because I believe that how we answer that question tells us something important about where we actually are, not where we want to be. And I think you will be surprised by what other people say when they are honest too. And before you go, there is one more thing I need to tell you. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt close to something you are carrying, if there is a person in your life who made you who you are and who has not heard your voice in longer than you want to admit, then this video has already done the most important thing it came here to do. Pick up the phone, make the call, drive the distance, open the door. Not because it will be easy or clean or free of everything that accumulated in the silence, but because Walter Calloway sat on a Chicago sidewalk for 4 mornings in a winter coat in the cold on the chance, just the chance, that his son would look up. That is what it looks like when someone refuses to stop believing in you. The least you can do is look up. And if this is your first time watching here, this is the kind of story we tell on this channel. Stories that are real and human and worth your time. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. And share this one with someone who needs to hear it today. You already know who that person is.